and that is part of the annual Stanford Global Studies Film Festival. The theme this year is Common Worlds, Limitless Realities, Futurism and Fantasy in Global Cinema. My name is Farah Al-Sharif, and I am the Associate Director of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. For this year's Summer Film Festival, the Abbasi Program picked Dune Part One, the six-time Academy Award-winning film, which is a 2021 American epic science fiction film directed by Denis Villeneuve. It is the first of a two-part adaptation of the 1965 epic novel by Frank Herbert. It is punctuated by obvious Middle Eastern and Islamic influences and themes. Dune is set in the very distant future in the year 20,000 or so. And the film follows the story of the Fremen and Paul Atreides, a messianic-like figure who is thrust into a deadly war in an inhospitable desert planet called Arrakis. For the discussion today, we are very pleased indeed to have Haris Durrani to discuss with us themes of Islamic futurism and science fiction in Dune. Haris is a Ph.D. candidate at Princeton University, where he studies the histories of law, technology, and empire. Previously, he earned a J.D. and a B.S. from Columbia University and an M.Phil from the University of Cambridge. He is also a fiction writer himself. His debut book is Technologies of the Self, and his recent work has appeared in McSweeney's Quarterly Concern and the Gollancz book of South Asian science fiction. Haris was interviewed by NPR for his work on Dune, and he has written about Herbert, Islam, and Dune in the Washington Post, Tor.com, and Newlines magazine. So he has deservedly garnered himself the label or accolade of being a bona fide Dune expert. So I can't think of a better person to discuss with us the film today. So thank you for joining us, Haris.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor, and I'm a fan of the Abbasi program. So thank you, Farah.
Thank you very much for your kind words. So to start us off, it would be great if you could tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and how and why you became so interested in science fiction generally, and more specifically in Herbert's Dune.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And also, I hope my connection is coming through okay. I had to use my phone for Zoom, so hopefully it's coming through okay.
You're crystal clear, and we can see the Dune theme background.
Siege Tabor, that's my positionality, is the siege in the deep desert, and a little pocket of blue spice. Nice. But yeah, so the way I came to Dune, so my dad is from Pakistan, my mom is from Dominican Republic. I grew up Muslim, especially after 9/11, which was a very unique generation. And I remember, I think my first introduction to Dune actually occurred before I ever existed. Because one of my parents' first dates was to see the David Lynch Dune film in the 1980s. And when they went, when you go to the theater, they handed out a glossary. It was so complicated. They had a glossary of all the terms in Dune. And I think somehow that stuck in my parents' head. And then after 9/11, my mom is a big reader, and she always was encouraging me to sort of engage with literature by Muslims, or at least about Muslims, in a positive light. And she had come across the Dune, and the fact that she hadn't even realized it beforehand, but so much of Dune, the novel, contains so much Islamic history and theology, and also just beyond Islam, just has a lot to say about culture and religion and technology. And I was always a huge sci-fi fan, and also a lot about colonialism as well. You know, I'm sort of a diasporic effect of two colonial places. And so she was like, oh, you should check out this book, Dune. And I read it as a kid, I think in middle school, and it just blew my mind, because it felt like it was I've said this before, but it felt like the weird uncle at the mosque or something, like spinning this crazy tale about Muslims in the far future and how, Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism and Islam might all interact 20,000 years in the future. And as a kid reading that, that was just a very mind blowing experience. And it wasn't just about seeing myself on screen or on the page, but was sort of digging into the sort of subconscious of my own history and intellectual and religious upbringing.
Okay, so I'm not surprised we have your brilliant immigrant mom to thank for introducing you to this world. That's really awesome. So, having read the novel and then watched the Villeneuve adaptation, let's just start with this. Did you enjoy the film? Was it an enjoyable watching experience for you, or did you enjoy the novel a bit more?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because sometimes I write a lot about the film and aspects of it I don't like, but I actually, for the most part, I enjoyed the film.
Mm.
I thought it was very well done in terms of the acting. Denis Villeneuve is one of my favorite directors. The cinematography is just stunning. But I think at the same time, it's not, I wouldn't call it an amazing film or a great film.
Mm.
I remember my first thought after walking out of the theater, I was so excited to see it. And then when I walked out, I sort of thought, okay, like it didn't wow me. It was
Oh,
something about it felt um, it missed an emotional there, and a sort of distinctive, specific voice
yeah.
that, despite all of the sort of talent of the aesthetics of the film, I felt wasn't there. But I still enjoyed it. It's not a bad film. Um,
Okay. Good.
yeah,
I felt the same. I felt a little bit underwhelmed, but I was also dazzled by it too. So it's like this,
exactly.
mix of feelings. We'll talk a little bit more about, how the novel compares to the films, particularly in terms of the Muslimness factor. But before that, I wanted to ask you more generally about this idea of Islamic futurism. Before we go into the specifics of the film and the novel, would you say that Dune broadly could classify as a genre of Islamic futurism?
Definitely, I think Dune could definitely classify as an Islamic futurist work because, I mean, not just because it's using elements of Islam, but also because, uh, at least in my reading, the fundamental question, at least of the novel, I would say this is not the question of any of the adaptations, but of the novel, is what would Islam look like 20,000 years from now? How would it change? What would remain the same?
Mm.
And in that sense, it is exactly asking this question about what is Islam in the future. On the other hand, it does incorporate so many other faiths and cultures that aren't always associated with Islam that I
Yeah.
hesitate to say it's only Islamic futurism. It's also Christian futurism and Jewish futurism and all these other things, and Buddhist futurism.
Interesting. Okay, we'll want to hear more. That's quite a tease, but we'll get into that. So, let's go back to this comparison between the novel and the film. You've noted in your articles that the novel had deep Islamic or Muslim influences. The film erases them. In the Washington Post, you said this. So, how does the film erase the Muslimness of Dune?
Yes, well, this is the Washington Post article is very short, but I could go on for an hour about all the erasures in the film. I think for me, the main, I mean, well, let's backtrack. If you look at the statements of the screenwriters and the director for the recent Dune film, they exactly say, oh, in the novels, the Arab aspects, and they're implying the Islamic aspects,
Yeah.
those are just cosmetic. They're not fundamental to the story. They were just a way of sort of exotic set dressing to
Mhm.
say, oh, we're in this distant, far away future place. And they have no actual fundamental relevance to the themes and the content of the story of Dune. And so they cut it out because they felt that they didn't want to cater to that kind of racist narrative in their mind. But if you actually look at Frank Herbert's interviews, he literally says Islam is a very important part of our world. He's saying it's not exotic, and he said the purpose, he mentions Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and says, and then he adds, he says, Islam is a very central part of the entire Dune series. And he says, I wanted to show that the positive aspects of Islam and its relevance throughout society, not just in what one might call the Muslim world, which itself is a sort of fraught category. And I think whether he realized it or not, Frank Herbert himself was challenging the Orientalist boundaries of the Muslim world by showing Muslimness as a pervasive part of society in many places, in the past and in the future. But it's not just, I would say, about the intent. You can always, make a death of the author argument and say, okay, the intent of the screenwriters or the intent of Frank Herbert doesn't necessarily matter. But if you even dig into the characters, the motifs, even the aesthetics of the novel versus the film for me is definitely an erasure. There are I won't say there are not Islamic elements, but I think the Arabic and Islamic elements are there only they basically put in the minimum amount that is necessary to tell the story and cut out as much as they could, even to the degree of the languages they created in Dune. For me, the biggest erasure is the aesthetics of the film. Wow. But we can talk about that. I'll stop there for now.
Okay. Yeah, no, feel free to go ahead and tell us more. So what does the film, let's start with this. What does it get right?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I don't mean to just poo-poo on the film, because I did enjoy it, and I think there are aspects of it that were successful. I think, surprisingly, despite what many of the sort of trendy headlines might say about the use of the white savior narrative in the film, I actually think it gets it right, if not in some cases better than the book, in terms of dealing with the white savior narrative. The film starts with Zendaya's character, a Fremen character, talking about colonialism, and then she talks about the Harkonnen oppressors and says, who will be our next oppressor? And then the very next shot is Timothée Chalamet, who's our hero, right? Throughout the story, you see his mother's reaction to him as he gains his sort of metaphysical, spiritual power, and her, in some cases, fear or anxiety about the thing that he's going to become. He has these visions of this violent future that he's going to bring about. All of this is pretty obvious stuff for me. I think some audience members may not have been so obvious, and I think even the scene at the very end where he kills the Fremen character is a kind of brutal scene that he's not really at least in my reading, it's not a great thing that he's killing this guy.
Right.
And there are a lot of other very subtle cues. So throughout the film, it continually returns to the bull. And I think it's only mentioned once that the bull is the bull of the main character's grandfather. So the father of Duke Leto Atreides. And it's meant to symbolize, the grandfather died, he was a bullfighter, and he died. I mean, he was a king, but he was a bullfighter as well. And so there's a kind of the arrogance of the man in power who thinks he can, wave his flag in front of the bull, and ultimately is killed by the thing that he taunts, right? And so they're constantly referring back to that is clearly, that's something that's present in the novel, but is made very explicit, I think, at least in this subtle cues back to that bull throughout the movie, that Denis Villeneuve knows what he's doing in terms of critiquing Paul as this character who's rising in power, but is also susceptible to the ego of power as well, and the violence that might bring. I have other problems as well with the film, but I think that aspect, to me, for the most part, it's very clear that Paul Atreides is not the good guy. And I think one way of thinking about it is that Denis Villeneuve is not a typical blockbuster filmmaker. He's an indie filmmaker. So everything he does is through, he's not going to tell you who someone is. He's going to show you through the sort of the subtle cues, and he's a minimalist filmmaker. He's not going to tell you up front, but he's going to show stuff like the bull or these, the visions, or just the way that Timothée Chalamet acts when he has the spice visions of the jihad.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think he completely villainizes, Paul's character. It's up to the audience to kind of, both kind of relate to the hero's journey, that his slow start, and then the test that he got, and just the signs that he gets. So it's not like an outright a loathing of Paul, but there are the darker undertones there in terms of sort of like warning us that this may not be a hero story, more of an anti-hero scenario. But does let's go back to Herbert for a little bit. Is Herbert also suspicious of this messianic white savior figure, or does he have this anti-colonial acumen? You said he was writing in the 60s, so could he have been sort of on the Fremen side completely, or is he also sort of introducing this character but with suspicion and sort of a warning as to what might happen if, a savior like figure comes in and swoops in and takes over? So what is Herbert's stance on that?
Yeah. No, that's a loaded question. That's a great question. I think there's sort of two questions in that question. The first is Frank Herbert pro Fremen? Is he pro decolonization during the 1960s? And then the second part is he pro Messiah
Right,
figure?
exactly.
And they're related, but not necessarily the same.
Okay.
Um, at least in my reading of the novel and the sequels, because part of the project of Dune, I mean, this is one of the ways in which it is, to my mind, fundamentally Islamic, is he's asking these questions about a savior figure, a prophet figure, and what would it be like if a prophet appeared in the future. He's not saying that, I mean, there are analogies between Paul Atreides and, for example, the prophet Muhammad, but there's also, the prophet Muhammad exists in the history of Dune. He's referenced in the novel,
Oh, wow.
obliquely, and he's compared to Paul, but it's clear that Paul is not actually the prophet. He's just like the prophet.
Okay.
And really what Frank Herbert is asking is, if someone came in the future with prophecy or claimed prophecy, what would result? Would that be a good thing, a bad thing? How would a society deal with that question? And it's basically through this. I mean, he's drawing, of course, on Jesus as well and other prophetic figures, but it's mainly through Islamic history that he's dealing with this question, because he's drawing on the problems of succession after the prophet's death,
Right.
on the history of Sunni and Shia societies. He's drawing on the idea of the Mahdi in apocalyptic in Islamic eschatology. And part of what and we can talk about that more in a bit. I'm sure you want to dig into the Mahdi, because Dune, really, that is what it is about. It's about the Mahdi.
Oh, wow.
It's about Twelver Shiism and all these things. Sorry, my phone. But to my mind, Herbert is sympathetic to the idea. To answer the question, he's sympathetic to the idea of the Messiah, and he does believe in the value of a spiritual connection with something beyond what's perceptible with human eyes and senses. But at the same time, part of the work of Dune is to explore the dangers of diving into the deep spiritual hole as well. It's sort of, in Islam, we talk about drunk Sufism, that you can get so deep into the spiritual hall that you sort of lose your sense, your grounding, your moral sense.
Yeah.
And part of what Dune is exploring is that question. And sometimes spirituality is a double-edged sword. It can be this source of great truth and justice, but also a source of social control as well, if someone is claiming a truth that they can't actually claim. So that's the answer to the Messiah question. I know I didn't answer the Fremen decolonization question.
Oh, that's brilliant, because I did pick up on that too. So the visions, they're very intense. You can tell the viewer can feel how, how dangerous they are when he gets sort of initiated into the mothers. I call it the Mother Sufi order, but it's like a sisterhood or sorority, and the Grand Sheikha sort of tests him, and you feel like it's mortally, like, obviously that's the feeling of mortal danger. And in the Sufi tradition, in the Islamic tradition, we read many instances of young initiates going into khalwa or solitude, or taking on invocations that they're not yet ready for, and the implications of that, and sort of this dichotomy between sober Sufism and sort of drunken Sufism. And I really appreciate that you brought that up. So I think a question for all our audiences right now is how does Herbert know so much about Islam? How is he so sympathetic or familiar? I mean, we have a low bar that I think when it comes to Muslim representation, we're always assuming the worst, unfortunately, that Muslims are going to be portrayed as terrorists or as exotic, others, or worse, not portrayed at all, right? But you can tell, like, from your work and from what you told us already, that Herbert is knowledgeable and sympathetic. Yes, he might be an Orientalist, or he is an Orientalist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he uses these themes with malice. So maybe share with us a little bit more about Herbert's background and knowledge of Islam.
Definitely. To be honest, I still wonder how he knows so much stuff. It's a question. I believe for his undergraduate, he studied, or he majored in, or he took some classes in comparative religion. And I'd really love to figure out who his professor is. So I'm putting out the bat signal if anybody might know. Because really, I think it would be kudos to that professor. That must have planted some seed in him. He just read voraciously. He said he read hundreds of books in preparation just to write the first Dune novel. And that includes, I tracked down the translation of the Quran that he probably had.
Wow.
I'm forgetting now which one, because there are parts of the later sequels where the characters just say lines that are Fremen sayings. But I read it, I said, oh, that's very familiar. And then I just, quote Googled it. And it's a translation of the Quran. So you can figure out what translations he was using at what time period in the 50s when he was writing this. He also read critiques of Lawrence of Arabia's narrative. So he was engaging in Arab traditions as well. And there's Ali Karju Raveri, a professor who's digging into some of Frank Herbert's Islamic themes and his relationship with the 20th century, has been going into some of Frank Herbert's archives, and he's actually found letters to Semitic friends. So those could be Jewish friends, it could also be Arab friends. There's an interview in the 80s with Herbert where someone asks him, oh, what is Dune? Is it science fiction or fantasy or what is it? And Frank Herbert kind of smiles and he says, oh, some people say it's speculative fiction. My Arab friends, they say it's religious philosophy or something like that. And he doesn't say it like, oh, my Arab friends, like I have Arab friends as a claim to anything. He just says it very casually as kind of just like a way into understanding what Dune is doing.
Yeah.
But I thought it was very interesting, the casualness of that reference, right? That he's not making a point of it. Like people in the 1980s that they don't care about like representation, like, you know what I mean? It's not like a thing that he's dealing with.
Right.
So that's a very interesting question. I think he knew people because some of the stuff, the way he speaks isn't just from book knowledge. It's as if he knows people, you know?
He knows people. Yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
very mafia-like. I know people. But yeah, no, it's astonishing. And I know you take a deeper dive into Herbert's politics. There's a Newlines magazine article that I recommend our audience to check out, or I can paste the link in a little bit. But it's Harris calls Herbert a Republican Salafi. So if you're curious to learn more about this sort of interesting figure, Frank Herbert, and his politics and how he came to be who he is, or what he's really about in sort of real life, then do check out that article. Okay, so we've talked about a lot. So right now I'd like to sort of bring us back into kind of more themes that present themselves in the film and in the novel. Particularly, let's go back to the theme of colonization. So we have this spice that is a valuable commodity, and there's the struggle for freedom. I have not read the novel, and I think now all our attendees are going to put the novel in their shopping basket to buy it, and I will certainly definitely read it. It's been on my list to read for a long time now. But Herbert describes, he actually uses the word jihad as an inner struggle and as a struggle for freedom in a positive connotation. I think the film erases that, calls it a crusade instead. But tell us more about this sort of anti-colonial struggle, or this struggle for freedom, however way you want, whether you want to reference the film or whether you want to reference the novel. It's up to you.
So, certainly, no, that's great. So yeah, in the book does refer to jihad, holy war, and crusade interchangeably, but jihad is the word that is most used.
Wow.
And in the film, they get rid of that. And there is definitely, that is one of the elements of erasure, but the use of jihad in the novels, I think, there are just multiple layers of how Frank Herbert is using it. I'm not sure how intentional he was, but reading it today, the use of jihad in the novels really is subversive, or it has at least a subversive effect, regardless of his intent. Because you're right, he is using jihad in a positive light, but not always. There's sort of I think of it as sort of three layers of a jihad analysis in Dune, right? So the bottom layer is what the people who made the recent film thought jihad meant, which is, oh, jihad is evil, terrorists, Muslim bad guys, the Arab enemy, the other. And so they got rid of it. Then the second layer is, jihad is the anti-colonial revolution. Those are like the freedom fighters, right? And there's an element of that that's very present and very real and genuine in the novels. And you can see, if you just threw in jihad to describe what's happening in the film, you can feel that as well. That there's a sort of a glory to the anti-colonial fight,
Right.
And an honor to it. But in addition, there's a sort of third layer, which I think is the most interesting and complex aspect of the novels, which is that jihad in the novels is not a term. I mean, maybe the word is indigenous to the Fremen, but it's not the languages are sort of floating everywhere throughout the Dune universe. It's not like the people who speak Pseudo-Arabic are only on Arrakis. Right. But anyways, the idea of the jihad as it appears in the novels is often a sort of colonial implant among the Fremen. It's not actually indigenous to them, brought by the Bene Gesserit missionaries. And it's very interesting because part of the fear, these visions that Paul, the main character, the hero, is having of the future, are these visions of this jihad that he's going to bring. Right. And this is present in the book, in the movie, but it's even more present in the novel, that the jihad is related to the genetic seed of Paul. The fact that he is the relative he is in the bloodline of the Harkonnen bloodline, which is this evil, violent, belligerent bloodline, and it is that sort of dark blood, that violent traits that he is carrying as the Kwisatz Haderach, that he's carrying into the jihad. And so the jihad isn't just an anti-colonial thing, but it is also a sort of counter-revolution brought about by the missionaries. And it's very interesting because in the history of decolonization and jihad itself, notions of jihad and Salafism themselves have certain ideas of it have roots from Christian missionaries and how they approached and reinterpreted and fed back to Muslims in various parts of the Arab world and in South Asia, how Islamic history and theology is interpreted and reinterpreted. And it very much parallels what's happening in the Dune novels. I don't know to what degree Herbert was actually aware of this, but I think to me that's what elevates it so much, because the jihad is if the Muslims are if jihad is associated with terrorism, then it's the colonizers who are the terrorists. But it's also about this kind of Foucauldian, Fanonian internal colonization as well. And there's a lot more else I could say about jihad, and there's a whole other reading about how maybe the Fremen, they know that this is a colonial implant, but they still believe in the genuine jihad, the anti-colonial fight, and they're kind of taking advantage of Paul as this hero figure as a way to get to like jumpstart their revolution. And there's so many interesting readings you could do in the novel, and potentially in the film, depending on part two, which is coming out soon, I hope.
Right. So yeah, are you excited about part two, or now that our viewers here have seen part one, is there anything you have heard about a part two that you could say for us to like pique our interest? Will the representation this time be a little bit, more inclusive of Muslim or Middle Eastern casts? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm very excited for part two. So for those who don't know, what they've done for the film is they've broken up the novel into two parts. So what is the first Dune film that we saw for this film festival, hopefully, is basically the first half or 2/3 of the novel. And then now for the second film is going to be the last third or so of the novel. And they might do a third film adapting the second book, which is my favorite book in the series.
Is it?
But yes, we can talk more. But I'm excited for it. I think, just in terms of, as a work of art and the sort of storytelling aspects,
Yeah.
what's very interesting with Frank Herbert is he's a little bit like, I mean, he's not obviously on the level of Shakespeare, but he's a little bit like Shakespeare and some other famous playwrights, in that a lot of the action happens off screen, or he just doesn't really care so much about the action. And then he'll spend, 2 pages on like a worm climax of like a fight with worms coming out of the sand, and then he'll spend 10 pages doing like a spice vision or something.
Yeah.
And so that last third of the novel is pretty much all climax. There's going to be some setup, and then it's just going to be all climax, at least that's what's in the book. So I'm very interested to see how they develop out the characterization and the details of how the action goes down. And action itself can be a form of storytelling.
Right.
So I'm interested in the artistry of how they do that from a storytelling perspective. In terms of casting, I am a little bit upset because they've started casting most of the characters, and they're all like, so the guy who plays Elvis in the recent Elvis film, Austin Butler, I think, great actor. He's going to be playing the same guy that Sting played in the Lynch adaptation. He's going to play a guy named Fade.
Okay.
So we have a white guy playing a guy named Fade,
Okay.
and Christopher Walken will be playing the Emperor, the Padishah Emperor, which is pretty much based on a combination of the Ottoman Empire and some
Yeah.
aspects, some Russian stuff as well.
Interesting.
So I mean, I think the casting is great. Like, they're great actors, and I think they're actually very well fit for the role.
Right.
But it just would be nice to have someone who knows how to pronounce these words.
Right.
And they do have cast. I think her name is Sohaila Jacob. She's a Swiss Tunisian actress to play Chiskali, who is a very small role in the novel. She basically trains Paul in how to mount and ride a sandworm. So it's a very important scene in the novel. That's an epic scene, but it is a small role. Maybe they'll expand it more, hopefully. And it's also notable that it's a gender switch as well. So the character in the novel is the male, and here just casting a woman actress. But I am a little bit cautious. I know there's a great YouTube channel called Secrets of Dune.
Okay.
And they had a great, I believe the person who runs it is of Arab or Muslim descent. And he has a sort of great analysis recently of the problems of representation in the film and in possibly part two, and talking about how you do have a few roles from the Middle East and North Africa in terms of casting, but they're often very minor roles. And the central characters are never, people from these backgrounds. So we'll see how it happens. For me, what I most hope for, and maybe we can talk about it more, is just if they can deal with the aesthetics of how the film is told, regardless of the casting stuff. That, I think, to me would be the best. Because for me, reading the book, the thing I love the most is that it feels very Islamic, and Jewish and Buddhist and all these things. And there's a way in which the film didn't feel like that, at least for me personally.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Because
also, if I may, sorry, just one other thing is, I hope they can bring in indigenous, Native American actors as well, because I wanted to shout out, also super important, is the fact that Frank Herbert was very close with the Quileute tribe in the United States
Mm,
and had a lot of relations with decolonization from the Native American and indigenous perspective. And if they can, bring in some Native American actors, that would be great.
right.
I don't think
Yeah.
that's happening, but
Yeah, well, we'll
yeah,
won't hold our breath too much. But you did mention that there's also a TV adaptation, a prequel of sorts. I hadn't heard of that, so that might interest
yeah.
our audience today, that to look out for that. Haris, when we spoke earlier, he mentioned. Do you want to say a little bit more about the prequel?
Yeah, uh I'm cautiously excited about it. It's going to so Dune takes place 20,000 years in the future. And if you Google year Dune or something like that, the first thing it'll say is probably, it
And
takes place in the year 10,000.
yeah,
But that's because the Dune timeline starts at
uh,
10,000 years from our present.
I see.
Because around that time period, there's something called the Butlerian Jihad,
Oh,
another jihad, which is basically a war against machines, where machines become sentient, and so then we have a whole humans battle the machines and defeat the machines, and that's why in the Dune universe there are no sentient AI. Sentient machines are banned, so that's why you have mentats, like human computers. Um, so I believe the show is going to take place somewhere around the period after the Butlerian Jihad, after the defeat of the machines.
mhm.
And it's called Dune The Sisterhood, and it's going to be about the early days of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. So I'm very excited for that. The director, the showrunner, Diane Ademu-John, she's done a few science fiction action TV shows before. And I believe she did her undergraduate at George Washington, where she studied the Middle East and international relations. So who knows? Maybe there'll be something there. Because I
Yeah,
think one of the coolest aspects of the Bene Gesserit is that it is, about the Jesuits. Frank Herbert says it's meant to sound like the Jesuits.
right.
But
That's
it's also very explicitly about the Fatimids in North Africa as well, and the
interesting.
history of Shia. It's very obvious. The references, he directly references the Fatimids, and it's Dune is he clearly read Ibn Khaldun and is referencing Ibn Khaldun's narrative of the Fatimids in the Muqaddimah.
Wow.
And if they can bring that in, yes, please. I doubt it, but please, if you can do that, that would be great.
Sending out another bat signal
Yeah.
from the Abbasi program to Hollywood, the consultant for hire here. So, but yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Thank you for sharing the wealth of your knowledge and for piquing our excitement. I don't think there were any spoiler alerts, so whoever was, I think we have one Q&A comment here, like, please don't spoil anything for us, but I don't think anything was, there was no, like, it's not like you've have seen the films or anything like that. But I have one last question from my end, and then maybe we can move to the audience questions. I want us to circle a little bit back and talk more about sort of the theme of the Mahdi, Islamic eschatology, sort of what Paul really represents and how that ties into sort of a vision for a Muslim future, one that is, to borrow from the SGS Film Festival, limitless in reality and scope, and something that perhaps can, I don't know, leave the viewer with a sense of awe that perhaps Islam as it exists in our world today is not fully realized, but maybe science fiction can offer a horizon in which, themes of Islamic eschatology can offer something a bit more interesting or dynamic than what we're seeing right now. So I thought, I'd bring that up and just to comment on, again, go back to the idea of Islam, futurism, and whether you, as someone who's an avid Dune enthusiast or expert, can say something a little bit about that, about whether you feel like the Dune novel can offer something hopeful about Islam and the future.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great question. And I'm laughing a little bit because Dune is a very dark series, and you're asking me to find hope. But I know there are elements of hope. I think the first thing I wanted to say about Islamic futurism and futurism in general is sometimes there's a tendency to look towards the future in this sort of linear narrative of progress. That the future is going to give us salvation, it's going to give us utopia, and that itself has a sort of, you know, to reference the philosopher Hegel, that has like a Christian Hegelian liberal framework. And I think one of the coolest aspects of science fiction is that science fiction doesn't necessarily have to take place in the future, and you can find the future in the past. So, for example, the stuff that I write in fiction, most of it takes place in the present or the past, or if it takes place in the future, it's about the continuity of the past and the future. And I think, if you're going to talk about Islamic eschatology and the Mahdi, there have been multiple claims to the Mahdi historically in the past, during decolonization and beforehand. And so in some sense, that's the future in the past. And what Frank Herbert is doing, he knows some of that stuff he knew about and he was drawing on. And one of the coolest aspects of Dune is that he's not inventing a future that's like our past. Our past exists and our present exists. And he's both reinterpreting and speculating and spinning out that past into the future and showing how there are certain things that last often, and some elements of society and social structures that continue, and even of religion.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the Islamic eschatology stuff is definitely a way into the future, but not necessarily the future in time, but at least in imagination. And I think that can be a very powerful thing. Also, the one thing I wanted to say as well on the eschatology stuff is, it's interesting throughout the novels that Herbert is playing with the idea of who is the actual Mahdi. And it's challenged of whether Paul is the true Mahdi or his son, or several other characters. And there's one character, I'm not going to spoil anything. He died. He's a fan favorite among the readers of the novels and the film. He dies in the first film and in the first book. He is reincarnated several times across the 6 novels. And in the 6th novel, which was meant to be the penultimate one, Frank Herbert died before writing the 7th. Frank Herbert, it's the 12th incarnation of this character who is said to be the Mahdi. And at least in 12 Shiism, the Mahdi is the 12th Imam. And it's very obvious that that's what the whole thing is about. So yeah, I think so these things are just very fun to play with. And it's just Islamic history and culture and intellectual life is such a rich playground for the imagination, whether you're writing about the future or the past. And I really hope this is an inspiration for more people to write more stories like that. Yeah.
It's a good plug-in for your novel. People can buy it. Technologies of the Self, and we definitely applaud and encourage more, Muslim authors and creatives to take that vast space and that vacuum that exists for narrative and storytelling. So thank you for doing that, and we wish you much success in your, future endeavors and future writing. We're going to be huge fans of yours as always. So let's now go to our audience Q&A. We have a question here from Soraya Moham. She asks, hello from San Diego. Hi, Soraya. In your opinion, what is the metaphorical relevance of the desert worm or the sandworm?
Oh, I love this question. There's a my favorite article about Dune is by, I'm blanking on the author. I think it's Karen Christina Riding, I believe. And it's the title is something very simple, like the Arabic of Dune, or something like the Arabic of Dune. And it's a very simple article. It doesn't go into a lot of terms, but just takes a few and does a deep dive. And she has a deep dive on Shai Hulud, on the sandworm and the meaning of the sandworm in Arabic and other languages, and talks about the desert setting and the multiple meanings and metaphors. And in one respect, it is literally about the desert. Frank Herbert was initially inspired because he was a journalist who was writing about sand dunes in Oregon and about environmentalists and ecologists' attempt to control the environment. So it is about sand. And then of course he's also thinking about, the Middle East and the sort of stereotype of the Middle East as a desert. um, and But he's also thinking about water because he was, as I mentioned, he was very close with members of the Quileute tribe in Washington State, and their homeland was a very wet place.
Mm.
Um, and so he was thinking a lot about water. And the sandworm, I think he said at some point that the sandworm is meant to be like a whale. And if you, this professor writing, when she wrote her analysis of Shai Hulud, there's multiple meanings of what Shai Hulud could be. It could be an Arabic meaning for old man of the desert, or sort of old eternal thing. That's what the Fremen call it. But it can also be a reference to shaitan, because it sounds a little bit like shaitan. And at some point, the Fremen refer to Shai Hulud as shaitan, or the devil. And there are other elements where it's clearly meant to be some reference to a whale. And I just that's why I love Dune. Dune is one of my favorite works of art, and I can talk endlessly about it, is because there's so many layers, and that everything you can just constantly revisit it and find new things and debate. There is no one interpretation. It's meant to be this sort of a fractal
Yeah.
imagination.
That's very impressive. I think you've answered a 2-for-1 there. Cole was asking about themes of environmentalism, and you've very eloquently touched upon that. So thank you. We have a question here from Bob. Who, he says, thanks for giving a shout out to Hegel. He's in everything. He asks, did Frank Herbert also employ Shakespeare as an influence? It seems like some concepts from Macbeth, Hamlet, etc. are in Dune. For example, backstabbing royals, a son avenging a father's death, Paul carrying his father's sinus ring like Hamlet, witches, etc. So, yeah, take it away.
Yeah. No, that's another great question. I actually don't have a direct answer. In my research, I haven't focused so much on the Shakespearean influences. So in terms of what Frank Herbert has said or written about, I don't know for sure. But in terms of just doing an analysis of the book, I agree 100%. There's so many Shakespearean elements, even in parts of the dialogue. I mentioned the fact that he likes to have action occur off screen or off the page. Even the Bene Gesserit have very much of a Lady Macbeth kind of vibe, which is, can potentially be read in a negative way, although I've also read very interesting feminist interpretations of the Bene Gesserit as well. There is definitely a very strong Shakespearean element. Actually, one interesting film I would recommend on Netflix, I believe it's called The King, with Timothy Chalamet, which is based on a series of Shakespeare's plays about King Henry. And it's very interesting watching it, how many parallels there are with Paul's journey in Dune. And it makes me wonder if that's part of why they cast him for the role.
Interesting. Yeah. And you could definitely see influences of Jung and Campbell, and sort of the, that archetypal hero's journey type of thing. So definitely interesting to look into more of Herbert's influences. Let's move on to another question here. Scott asks about aesthetic values. What exactly defines the aesthetics of the film? I know you felt that they left something to be desired. So maybe that's a chance for you to comment a little bit more on aesthetics.
Thank you for that question. I'm also really glad that was asked, because now I can discuss because I think one of the difficult aspects of the novel is that there's a lot of words. And when you're dealing with a film, the language of film is not language. It's visuals, it's sound. And so it's in some sense, it's a challenge to take what is one of the greatest benefits of the novel in terms of the at least the Islamic and the Christian and Jewish and Buddhist stuff, those motifs, which are in the linguistics, and translate that into a film. That's a challenge. But I think for me, the important thing about the novel is that isn't so much the language in and of itself, but the sort of affect that the language creates in the reader. It creates this feeling of being in this very Muslim-y space, right? And I think there's something that's lacking in the film in that respect. So I'm not asking for the film to give me like a whole description of Shai Hulud, the meaning of Shai Hulud, and all of this, right? So for example, I'll give specific examples. When I wrote my article for the Washington Post critiquing the film, I said that the music sounds very generic. It's a very whitewashed music. It's kind of a white person's idea of what like ethnic music sounds like. And I said, oh, it's like vague. I said exactly something like, oh, it sounds like, because so Hans Zimmer, a very famous composer, did the music and with some collaborators. One of his collaborators is the same woman who he did the Lion King soundtrack with. And I said in my op-ed, this was just speculation. I just said, it sounds like they're just recycling this sort of like vaguely African motifs of the Lion King. And since I wrote that, there have been several interviews with the Hans Zimmer and the musicians that worked on the film. And Hans Zimmer, he literally says, I worked with my colleague we worked together on Lion King, and we wanted to do something similar here for like the Africa vibe. And then he says at one point, I wanted to, Arrakis is ethnic, so we had to have wood instruments. Like what does ethnic mean? And there's a great article by Gavia, what's her name? Gavia Baker Whitelaw, on the music of Dune, the musical aesthetics of Dune. She talks about how the film uses the instrument, the duduk, which is it's not like I mean, it is an Arab instrument, but it's one that's more often used in Hollywood films to connote like an Arab otherness. I have no musical talent, so I'm not going to try to do the sound. What do you think of, if you think of like Hollywood Orientalist music, Arab music, this is what it is. And that's what there's a few moments in the film that shows up. And then even in the architecture of the film, some people mention that the architecture of Arrakis looks like Timbuktu. It's not based on Timbuktu. If you go to the interviews, they say it's based on German feudalism. And then they say that the Atreides buildings are based on the fall of the Japanese Empire, which is kind of like a little bit of an Orientalist kind of like, oh, the sick decaying Oriental Empire motif. And then there are other, they use bagpipes. I actually love the bagpipes aesthetically. I thought it was great. But there's nothing in the novels about the Atreides being Scottish. And I think, to me, I used to be very happy that Villeneuve was doing I still love him as a director. Denis, if you're watching this, I love you. But I used to be very excited about him doing the Dune films, because he had done one of my favorite films of all time, Incendie, which is all a metaphor for the Lebanese Civil War and diaspora. And it's so many similar themes with Dune. But I think one aspect that I've missed is that Incendie, it lives in metaphor and in vagueness and lack of specificity. And I think for that film, it works. But if you look at all of Villeneuve's films, they're usually not very specific. They're very, he loves the idea of sort of metaphor and ambiguity. Whereas, and for Dune, the reason Dune as a novel works so well is its specificity. And it's through the specificity that you get this aesthetics. And so when he has this vague idea of this future planet, he's drawing on these vague concepts, and then he goes to like Scotland or like German brutalism or the fall of the Japanese Empire. When if you actually just draw on the fact that the Atreides are based on the Greeks, you could have had some very interesting, I'm not saying it has to be all Muslim, right? You can do all kinds of interesting stuff with the specificity that just was really lacking for me and very frustrating, but I'll shut up there.
No, this is amazing. We're getting so much, deep analysis, not to not to mimic like a sandworm type of image, but I feel like we've really gone through a deep dive of Dune, and this is amazing. I have two questions here about the Fremen and Arrakis. What is the significance of the blue eyes, if any? Does Herbert describe the Fremen as having blue eyes? And then we have Another question from Zach. Hi, Zach. He's curious about the spice. Does it have any religious significance or source? So I'll let those two questions be the last question for us too, because we have reached the 1 hour mark. So take it away, Haris.
Great questions. So the blue eyes, that's a good question. I don't have a clear answer to that. Some people have speculated that it's a reference to, there's the very famous image of the Afghani girl with the blue or green eyes. It could be that. To be honest, I'm not totally sure.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious, Fada, maybe it seems like maybe you have thoughts.
No, I really don't. So I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a point of contention always when, natives have, colored eyes or whatever. It exists as a theme, and it's an important question to be
Yeah.
raised. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it relates to the spice question because it's very interesting. In the novel, spice has different colors. It's not one thing. That was the other thing about the aesthetics, is how like bland Arrakis looked. Where's the color? But anyways, the blue in some parts of the novels, the spice is orange or brown, but then sometimes it gives off a kind of blue aura. And I believe the spice essence or the water of life is blue. I could be wrong. Don't at me. Which is if you crush a baby worm, you create the spice essence, which it's like the uncut, like in Breaking Bad, the pure blue crystal meth. It's like that, but it's spice.
Interesting.
And so maybe I think there's something that spice gives off a blue color, so something in the eyes. But you could probably do a whole analysis about sort of whiteness and race with the use of the blue eyes.
Right.
And in terms of other stuff about the spice and the meaning of the spice, I'm forgetting exactly the details of the question. It was just about the religious significance or the political.
Maybe political.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the spice, like everything in Dune, has multiple meanings. In one connotation, obviously, it's oil. Frank Herbert said it's about oil, but it's also many other things. It's about water. It could be any other potential resource
Right.
that Frank Herbert was thinking of, or that you can read into the source. It's not one thing. And actually, one thing that's very interesting that people sometimes miss is the spice is not fuel. The spice is there is already faster than light travel, but the spice is it's just a drug that guild navigators, which are human beings, ingest in such high degrees that they become monstrous in their appearance. So I'm excited for part 2. They'll probably show a navigator, and so basically navigators are human GPSs. They just take so many drugs that they can navigate through the stars by using their spice vision.
Very
so
cool.
Spice is not actually a fuel. It's just a drug.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah, it's like a hallucination. Yeah, got it. Well, with that, I feel like one more question from Soraya. She asks, what other films do you recommend we watch? Because it seems like you have quite the knowledge base about, these themes. And I'm sure there are fans out there who would like to, other than the sequel and the prequel, do you have any other similar films like Dune that you enjoy and think we can enjoy as well?
That's a good question. In terms of like Dune, in terms of the Islamic aspect, or in general? It is okay.
Yeah.
That's what I took it as. Yeah. So I actually really like Chronicles of Riddick, which is the Vin Diesel sequel to his film Dark. And it's very interesting because there's a black imam character. There's a bit of a motif of the black guy dies early, spoiler alert for the first half hour of the film. But the whole impetus of the film is this society that's a multicultural, multi-religious society on this planet, and then these colonizers come, but very Christian. Also, I don't mean to poo-poo Christianity. I think part of the interesting aspect even of Dune is how it explores multiple kinds of Islam and multiple kinds of Christianity. But anyways, there's a sort of colonial missionary Christianity associated with these colonizers that come to this planet in Chronicles of Riddick. And Vin Diesel's character, like they come, they kill his the imam character, and then who's his friend, and then he wants to fight back against the emperor, and the whole aesthetic, it feels very much like a Dune film. It's a dumb movie, but I really like it. In terms of other stuff, I'm hard pressed. I will, and if you want like a dumb fantasy action film that has good Muslim representation, Blood Red Sky is a big recommendation from me. It's very dumb. The pitch is Die Hard on a plane, but the Bruce Willis character is a single mother who's also a vampire.
Wow.
But
Okay.
there's one of the sidekicks in the film is a Muslim character, and the way that character is done is it is the Muslim representation that I want for our future.
Nice.
And I
Okay.
say that ironically, but also seriously, and you'll see what I mean when you watch the film.
Okay. Certainly piqued
It's
our
on Netflix.
excitement. Oh, on Netflix too. That's a plus. All right, perfect. So now we have plenty of leads to go away with here. This was thoroughly enriching. I feel like those who haven't read the novel now feel like they definitely should, and I think it would be a good idea to go ahead and read the novels before perhaps watching part two. Haris, we can't thank you enough for your time, for your expertise, for your insights. Definitely the best take on Dune ever. And we wish you continued success. And please do follow Harris's his writings. He's a wonderful writer. I'll paste the his blog. I think you have a blog, Harris, somewhere. Is it the
On Medium.
Medium? Yes, found it. Okay. Yeah, we should definitely check it out. I think because we've run out of time. So thank you to the audience for their engagement, and do sign up for the Abbasi mailing list on our homepage via Contact Us, or that's where you'll stay tuned for more from the Abbasi program. And again, Haris, thank you so much for your time. This was wonderful, and happy viewing, happy writing, and yeah, we really appreciate your expertise.
Thank you so much. It was an honor. I had a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to the audience for being here. I'm going to stop the recording.